By the freezing winter of 1940, the survival of the Western world was dangling by a fraying rope. While the history books focus on the heroism of the Battle of Britain, where the Royal Navy and the RAF successfully kept the German invasion force at bay, a far more lethal catastrophe was unfolding in silence behind the heavy oak doors of Whitehall. On the maps, the British Empire still appeared as a colossus, painting a quarter of the globe in imperial pink. But inside the treasury, the men who actually ran the war machine were staring at a terrifying secret. One so volatile, they dared not whisper it to the public. The empire was not just bleeding men, it was hemorrhaging capital. Britain was technically insolvent. Winston Churchill, the icon of defiance whose speeches were rallying the free world, found himself sitting in the subterranean damp of the cabinet war rooms, composing the most difficult letter of his career. It was addressed to Franklin D. Roosevelt, and it required Churchill to perform a diplomatic high-wire act. He had to confess to the leader of the world's wealthiest neutral power that Great Britain, the banker of the 19th century, the nation that had financed the defeat of Napoleon, was now completely broke. In his letter, Churchill laid out the strategic nightmare of the U-boat wolf packs strangling the Atlantic supply lines, but the real bombshell was buried in the financial details. He admitted that the moment was fast approaching when the British Treasury would no longer be able to pay cash for the tools of war. The British people were willing to fight on the beaches, but they could not fight with empty rifles, and they could no longer afford to buy the bullets. To understand how the wealthiest empire in human history fell into such destitution so quickly, you must understand the cold, transactional nature of the early war years. When Hitler marched in 1939, Britain was still a financial titan with billions in gold reserves and a massive portfolio of foreign investments, including railroads in Argentina and mines in Chile. But total war in the industrial age was a furnace that burned money at a rate no economist had predicted. Britain, an island nation, had to import everything: steel, oil, rubber, aluminum. With Europe blockaded, they had only one supplier left: the United States. However, the America of 1940 was not yet an ally. It was a wary merchant. The American public was deeply isolationist, haunted by the memories of World War I, where their sons had died in foreign mud for European quarrels that seemed to never end. To appease this voter base, Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts, which included a strict clause known as cash and carry. This law was brutal in its simplicity. Belligerent nations could buy American supplies, but they had to pay cash up front, and they had to transport the goods on their own ships. There was no credit. There were no loans. The Americans were happy to sell the arsenal of democracy, but they demanded gold on the barrelhead before the crates left the docks of New York. For the first year of the war, Britain frantically liquidated its national wealth to meet these demands. In a clandestine operation codenamed Operation Fish, the British government physically loaded the nation's entire gold reserve onto battleships and fast liners, shipping billions of dollars in bullion across the submarine-infested Atlantic to vaults in Montreal and Ottawa. It was the largest transfer of physical wealth in history, a desperate gamble to pay the American bill collectors. By late 1940, the vaults were empty. The liquid cash was gone. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington sat paralyzed, staring at contracts for planes and tanks they desperately needed but could no longer sign because London had run out of dollars. When Roosevelt read Churchill's plea, he understood the geopolitical stakes. If Britain fell, America was next. But he also faced a domestic political minefield. He couldn't just hand money to the British. American law forbade it, and the taxpayers would have revolted at the idea of a charity handout to an empire they viewed as a rival. Roosevelt needed a marketing masterstroke. He invented the concept of Lend-Lease and sold it to the press with a folksy, disarming analogy. Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire, and I have a length of garden hose. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire. Now, what do? I don't say to him before that operation, "Neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it." No, I don't want 15. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over. It sounded neighborly. It sounded sensible. It was brilliant political theater. But behind closed doors, the reality was not alone between neighbors. It was a foreclosure proceeding presided over by the icy Henry Morgenthau Jr., the U.S. Treasury Secretary. Morgenthau was a staunch anti-fascist who wanted to crush Hitler, but he was also the ruthless guardian of the American dollar. He operated on a strict principle. Before the United States provided a single dime of aid, Britain had to prove it had stripped itself of every last asset it possessed. He was not interested in British promises. He wanted collateral. Morgenthau demanded a total invasive audit of the British Empire. He didn't just want to know what the government owned. He demanded a list of every asset owned by private British citizens anywhere on the globe. He wanted the value of every share of stock, every overseas factory, every piece of real estate. The British negotiators, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, were aghast. They were being asked to open their internal ledgers to a foreign power, treated not as a heroic ally holding the line against tyranny, but as a bankrupt company in receivership. Phillips argued that Britain had already sold its gold, that a fire sale of long-term investments would yield pennies on the dollar and leave the country destitute after the war. Morgenthau remained stone-faced. His instructions from the president were absolute. The American taxpayer would not subsidize the British war effort if British elites still held lucrative investments in New York or Buenos Aires. The ultimatum was clear. Turn out your pockets or face the Nazis alone. The most brutal demonstration of this new special relationship was the fate of the American Viscose Corporation. This wasn't just a company, it was an industrial titan, the largest manufacturer of rayon and artificial silk in the United States, owned by the British firm Courtaulds. It was the crown jewel of British overseas investments, a profit machine that pumped millions of dollars back to London every year, helping to stabilize the British economy. Morgenthau looked at American Viscose and saw a target. He told the British negotiators bluntly, "Sell it." He wanted the cash from the liquidation deposited directly into the U.S. Treasury to settle existing bills for rifles and aircraft engines. The British resisted furiously. They knew the company was worth over $100 million. To sell such a massive asset in a panic, in the middle of a war, was financial suicide. It was the equivalent of selling your house for cash in an hour because you have a gun to your head. But Morgenthau held all the leverage. The Lend-Lease bill was stalling in Congress, attacked by isolationists who claimed Britain was actually hoarding wealth while begging for charity. Morgenthau needed a sacrificial lamb to show Congress that Britain was truly bleeding. He gave the British an ultimatum. Sell American Viscose immediately, or the Lend-Lease bill dies in committee. On a Sunday in March 1941, under immense pressure, the British government did the unthinkable. They seized the American Viscose Corporation from its private owners without permission, issuing a compulsory purchase order under emergency war powers. The sale was managed by a consortium of American investment bankers who smelled blood in the water. Because everyone knew the sale was distressed, because the seller was desperate, the bankers drove a merciless bargain. They sold the company for roughly $54 million. It was, effectively, a theft. The asset was worth at least double that amount. The British government was forced to reimburse Courtaulds in pounds back in London, adding to their own internal debt mountain, while the dollars from the sale vanished instantly into the U.S. Treasury. This was the moment the British elite realized the true price of survival. They were not partners. They were a junior entity being stripped of assets to pay for their own defense. The United States was absorbing the wealth of the British Empire not by conquest, but by contract. But the liquidation wasn't limited to stocks and factories. While financial negotiators argued over share prices, a far more significant deal was being cut involving the geopolitical foundations of the empire itself. The Royal Navy was desperate for destroyers. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could weld them together. The lifeline to North America was being severed. Churchill begged Roosevelt for 50 old destroyers, rusting World War I era hulks that had been sitting in mothballs for decades, of little value to the modern U.S. Navy. Roosevelt agreed to hand them over, but again, there was a price tag. He didn't give them, he traded them. In exchange for 50 obsolete ships that were barely seaworthy, the United States demanded 99-year rent-free leases on a string of British naval and air bases stretching from Newfoundland to the Caribbean, the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and British Guiana. Consider the scale of that trade. Britain handed the United States a strategic footprint that covered the entire Western Hemisphere. They gave away the keys to the Atlantic for a century in exchange for a temporary stopgap. It was a geopolitical fire sale, the act of a desperate man pawning his grandfather's watch to buy a sandwich. By the time the Lend-Lease Act was finally signed into law in March 1941, Britain had been stripped clean. The gold was gone. The U.S. investments were sold. The bases were leased. The Treasury was an echo chamber. Lend-Lease was hailed publicly as the arsenal of democracy, a noble act of solidarity. And in the immediate sense, it was. It provided the tanks, food, and oil that kept Britain in the fight. Without it, the Nazis would have likely starved the British Isles into submission. But the financial terms laid the groundwork for a post-war world where Britain would be a permanent debtor and America the undisputed creditor. The aid was never a gift, it was a lease. And hidden in the dense diplomatic language of the agreement was a poison pill known as Article 7. This small paragraph demanded that in return for aid, Britain would agree to dismantle its imperial preference system after the war. Imperial preference was the economic wall that held the empire together, a system of tariffs that favored trade between Britain and its colonies, protecting British industry from more efficient American competition. By signing Article 7, the British were agreeing to tear down their own economic defenses and open their markets to American exporters. They were signing the death warrant of their own trading bloc. The negotiators fought it, knowing it meant the end of the empire as an economic unit. But with German bombers overhead and the vaults empty, they had no choice. They signed. As the ink dried, the center of financial gravity shifted permanently. The gold reserves of the world had moved from London to Fort Knox, and they were never coming back. As the war ground on into 1942 and beyond, the alliance deepened militarily, but the economic chasm between the two nations widened into an unbridgeable canyon. American industry, supercharged by unlimited government spending and untouched by enemy bombers, didn't just grow. It exploded in size and efficiency. The United States was fighting a guns and butter war. Its factories were churning out B-17 bombers by the hour. But they were also producing radios, cars, and refrigerators for a global market that was increasingly hungry for American goods. Britain, conversely, was cannibalizing itself. To survive, the British government had converted every single factory to war production. They stopped making cars. They stopped exporting textiles. They abandoned their lucrative markets in Latin America and Asia. And who stepped into the vacuum left by the retreating British merchants? American corporations. The United States was effectively fighting the war, while simultaneously stealing its allies' commercial future. By 1944, the transfer of wealth was absolute. The British leadership, exhausted and battered, clung to a naive belief. They believed that their sacrifice would be honored. They convinced themselves that because they had stood alone against the Wehrmacht for 2 years, bankrupting themselves to save Western civilization, the Americans would treat them with generosity once the guns fell silent. They expected a soft landing, a transition period where Lend-Lease would continue to help rebuild their shattered infrastructure. They were wrong. They had forgotten the brutal lesson of the Viscose sale. In the world of high finance, gratitude is not a currency. On August 15th, 1945, the news flashed around the globe. Japan had surrendered. World War II was over. In London, the relief was physical. Strangers hugged in the streets, bonfires lit up the bombed-out skyline, and the crowds chanted for the king. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. But across the Atlantic, in the fluorescent-lit offices of Washington, D.C., there was no sentimentality. There was only a cold, bureaucratic machine that had been waiting for this exact second to switch gears. Just 7 days after the victory celebrations began, President Harry Truman signed a piece of paper that would devastate the British economy more effectively than any V-2 rocket. He signed the executive order to terminate Lend-Lease. The cutoff was immediate and absolute. There was no grace period. In the middle of the Atlantic, American Liberty ships loaded with wheat, meat, and tools bound for Liverpool were ordered to turn around and sail back to U.S. ports. The lifeline was severed. The British government was paralyzed by shock. John Maynard Keynes, the legendary economist and advisor to the Treasury, looked at the ledgers and saw the abyss. Britain was importing half its food and almost all its raw materials, paying for them with Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, the country was bankrupt, not in a year, but instantly. Keynes calculated that Britain faced a financial Dunkirk. The country would have to default, stop importing food, and cut rations to starvation levels. Social collapse and mass unemployment were days away. There was only one option left. Britain had to beg. In September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes boarded a ship for Washington. He was sick, frail, and suffering from the heart condition that would soon kill him. He was the greatest economic mind of the 20th century. But he arrived in America not as an intellectual giant, but as a supplicant. Keynes believed he had a moral case. He planned to look the Americans in the eye and argue that Britain had fought the war alone, while America remained neutral and profitable. Therefore, the United States should give Britain a gift, a grant of $6 billion, not as charity, but as a retroactive payment for the blood and treasure Britain had spent holding the line. He called it justice, but when he walked into the negotiation rooms, he found that justice was not on the agenda. The mood in Washington had hardened. The war was over. The American public was tired of paying for Europe's problems, and Congress was deeply suspicious of the new socialist government in London that had just nationalized the coal mines. They had no intention of using American capitalist tax dollars to fund a British socialist experiment. The American negotiators, led by the stone-faced Fred Vinson, told Keynes bluntly, there would be no gift. There would be no grant. There would only be a commercial loan, with interest, and it would come with strings attached designed to strangle the last remnants of Britain's economic independence. The most poisonous condition attached to the loan was sterling convertibility. The Americans demanded that within 1 year, Britain must make the pound sterling fully exchangeable for US dollars. During the war, Britain had protected its economy by forcing its colonies, India, Australia, Egypt, to accept payment in pounds, but forbidding them from exchanging those pounds for gold or dollars. This created a closed loop where these countries had to buy British goods because their money was useless elsewhere. The Americans wanted to smash that loop. They knew that if the pound became convertible, everyone holding British money would immediately sell it to buy dollars, because everyone wanted American machines, not British ones. Keynes knew this clause was a death trap. He argued, until his health broke, that it would cause a run on the pound that would drain the loan in weeks. But the alternative was starvation. Reluctantly, bitterly, the British Parliament voted to accept the loan, describing it as a financial Munich, an act of appeasement to survive. The agreement was signed in July 1946. Keynes died months later, his heart finally giving out under the stress of trying to save his country from its closest ally. But the tragedy was just beginning. The clock was now ticking on the American condition. The final act of this tragedy played out against the backdrop of the winter of 1947, a season so brutally cold it remains etched in the British national memory. Blizzards buried the rail lines, coal stockpiles froze into solid blocks of ice, and power stations shut down. The British people, having just won the greatest war in history, found themselves shivering in unheated homes, lighting candles because the electricity was gone. Bread, which had never been rationed even during the darkest days of the U-boat blockade, was now rationed in peacetime. This was the age of austerity, a gray, freezing reality that mocked the victory parades of 2 years prior. And it was in this atmosphere of frozen desperation that the American trap finally snapped shut. On July 15, 1947, strictly adhering to the deadline set by the loan agreement, the British government made the pound sterling fully convertible. The result was a financial massacre, exactly as Keynes had predicted on his deathbed. The moment the window opened, the world rushed to dump their British pounds to get their hands on precious US dollars. Countries that had been stockpiling sterling for years unloaded it in a panic. The money from the American loan, which was calculated to last the British government for years, began to evaporate in hours. In just one single month, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars in reserves. It was a run on the bank, but the bank was a nation. The hemorrhage was so violent that the government watched in horror as their treasury drained away. After just 5 weeks, on August 20th, they slammed the window shut, suspending convertibility and admitting total failure. They had burned through a massive portion of the loan for absolutely nothing. The humiliation was total. The British Empire had tried to play by American rules, and it had been crushed. This financial incapacity had immediate, earth-shattering geopolitical consequences. This was the precise moment the baton of world power was dropped by London and picked up by Washington. In February 1947, the British government sent a secret telegram to the U.S. State Department that essentially served as a letter of resignation from the role of superpower. For a century, Britain had been the guardian of the Mediterranean, financing the security of Greece and Turkey to keep rivals out. But with the treasury empty, they could no longer afford to pay the soldiers or subsidize the Greek government. The telegram effectively said, "We are broke. We are leaving. If you want to stop the communists, you have to do it." This message triggered the Truman Doctrine, where the United States stepped in to fill the vacuum. It was the formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a global policeman capable of shaping events. It was merely a regional power struggling to keep the lights on. The economic misery dragged on, a slow-motion decline that reshaped the British psyche. In 1949, with the economy still stagnant, the government was forced to devalue the pound. Overnight, the exchange rate was slashed from $4.03 to $2.80. In the blink of an eye, the British people became 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world. Imports soared in price, the cost of living spiked, and the realization set in that the British economy was no longer competitive. But the final bill for World War II wasn't just paid in the 1940s. It was a mortgage that spanned generations. The Anglo-American loan of 1946, the money borrowed just to keep the population from starving, was a commercial debt that had to be serviced. Every single year for 6 decades, the British Treasury wrote a check to the United States government. Through the post-war boom of the 50s, the economic gloom of the 70s, the upheaval of the Thatcher years, and into the modern era of the internet, the payments continued. The final installment was made on December 29, 2006. Think about the gravity of that date. 60 years after the guns fell silent, 60 years after the bunkers were emptied, the British taxpayers were still paying for the privilege of having survived the war. The story of the price of victory is the ultimate debunking of the idea that wars have winners in the traditional sense. In the modern era, total war is a negative-sum game for the combatants. Germany lost the war and was destroyed. Britain won the war and was bankrupted. The only true winner was the United States. The U.S. economy doubled in size. Its industry remained untouched by bombs. It held 2/3 of the world's gold. And through the ruthless mechanisms of Lend-Lease and the post-war loans, it successfully dismantled the trading preferences of the British Empire, opening up global markets for American dominance. The United States didn't conquer the British Empire with armies. It bought it. It acquired the bases, the markets, the technology, and the geopolitical influence in a distressed asset sale managed by the U.S. Treasury. For the British people, the legacy of 1940 remained a scar on the national soul, creating a lingering sense of decline, a feeling that the best days were in the past. It fueled the special relationship, which was always a polite diplomatic euphemism for dependency. When Winston Churchill wrote that letter to Roosevelt in the dark December of 1940, he undoubtedly saved his country from Hitler, but he also signed the deed of sale. He traded the empire for survival. It was a deal that had to be made. There was no other choice against the Nazi menace. But the cost was the future. Britain emerged from the flames as a moral giant, but an economic pygmy. It had spent its inheritance to buy freedom for Europe. It was a noble sacrifice, perhaps the noblest in history. But in the cold, hard light of economics, it was a liquidation. The empire didn't fall. It was sold off, piece by piece, to pay the bill for doing the right thing.